Drowning on Dry Land.
The fourth episode, parts 8 and 9. Part 8, going to hell in a handcart. And in a way, I was. For decades, Grady Memorial was known as Atlanta's St. Elsewhere, a crumbling inner-city hospital that took care of patients on the fringes with few resources but true dedication. Later, it was revived, formed a merger with Emory University Hospital, and became a modern medical marvel. But the Psych ER on the basement level hadn't received the memo. Now, I've been in several bloody accidents and on the scene of others. While in the military, I arrived to witness the aftermath of the terrorist bombing of my building and walked through the human and structural carnage. Those events were surreal, the kind that shift a brain into a shocked autopilot, but nothing like what I encountered that night in April. It was an actual madhouse. Two of the EMTs wheeled me through the doors and into a wild tableau. Dozens of men and women wandered about or crouched down in various stages of lunacy, some only half dressed. A few poor souls were weeping as if the last pieces of their hearts had been broken. Others sat mute and immobile. A couple tossed out streams of profanities, and one laughed in delirium. The babble of voices had me holding my hands over my ears. And then I heard a screeching voice over all the others. It belonged to the shift supervisor, and, not unlike the woman at the rental car counter, she had no patience with the wretched humanity that had been tossed into her presence that evening. And I'm guessing on every other night, too. It was clear from her icy, haranguing tone that she believed that every one of us hapless souls was at fault for his or own derangement. I mean, the woman was raging. She was a type we've all encountered before, the rude store clerk or customer service rep who appears to despise the rest of humanity. Weren't they told in their job interviews that they'd be dealing with, people? A nurse in bully training appeared to glare at me as she snatched the folder that had been placed on my stomach and then threw, and I do mean threw, a shopping bag containing a hospital gown onto the gurney. And one of the EMTs rolled me into a small room and told me to climb onto the metal table that was parked there with a thin blanket folded on top. "And stay here," he said. A med student who was working as a PA stepped out of the thrash of noise and motion and shocked me by asking kindly how I was faring. He seemed like a decent fellow, and I treated him to a Yossarian answer. I couldn't be better without being worse. He took that in stride and, keeping his voice calm, explained that they were going to find out what had happened to me. He said he'd be back in a few minutes. The turmoil resumed. At this moment, and at random others throughout the month-long ordeal to come, I would be hit by the absurdity of my situation and decide to inject a little humor into the proceedings. So, I tossed the gown aside, slid off the table, crawled underneath, and carefully placed the bag over my head. It worked. Everything went away, well, for a half minute, and then I heard that squawk again. Now the supervisor was yelling at my PA about the one under the table with the bag on his head. The PA, I'll call him Chris, stepped into the room and cajoled me into losing the chapeau, fashionable as it was, changing into my hospital gown, and getting back on the table, because the supervisor had been raging at him as if it was his fault. This roused my sympathy, and I did as he asked. As I lay down again, I felt the deep chill even with the blanket wrapped around me, and for the first time noticed that the back wall was a garage door. The notion came upon me in a blank moment that I was in fact dying and was in a morgue, lying on the cooling board just like in the old blues songs. Soon a van would pull up, the door would rise, and they'd take me away to complete my refrigerated death. I know, Did I mention that my brain had shattered? The thought of this fate was unbearably sad, and I found myself sighing with longing for what I was about to lose and would never know again. Some time went by, and the channel in my head switched again. How had I ended up in that place? Of course, it was the next stage in a plot. My writer's imagination flipped into overdrive. You want to know how people convince themselves of insane conspiracies? I could have taught a class that night. One crazy block was piled upon another as I twisted myself through a mad maze. In the end, it came out like this. My daughter, her mother, my wife, and their female friends and relations were part of an Irish traveler-style cult with a fiendish agenda. 20-odd years in the past, Italia's mom had seduced me into impregnating her and then purchased an insurance policy that would pay out when I died or was declared insane and locked away in a mental institution, whichever came first. Yes, it all made sense. I was just one of a dozen victims of this matrilineal cult, a handmaid's tale in reverse. It would explain all the whispers and laughter behind my back. I was being mocked for my ignorance as all this was transpiring. Though, I admit I paused to revel in being selected as stud material. As I sit here, over 2 years later, I cannot for the life of me fathom how I worked my way through this tortured illogic. But back then it was clear. They were all in on it, and the plot had reached its endgame. Soon I'd be on my way to some prison from which I'd never emerge, and the bounty would be collected. How could I have missed it? Some mystery writer I was. I stopped to wallow again in sorrow over all the hours and days and years that I had spent so deeply immersed in my daughter's life. Now I knew it had been a charade. On the other hand, what a cool setup for a work of fantastic fiction. Gangs of honeypots working a cottage industry off the sperm farming of clueless dupes, like me, then disappearing them and collecting the proceeds. Evil motives, dark sex, and what amounted to slow murders that would never be solved. I hadn't worked out all the details, but it went something like that, or it will go something like that when I write it. It went around and around in my head as I sat there in the midst of the howling commotion, waiting for my temperature to drop even lower, the hearse to come, and for me to die forgotten. Time after time over the weeks that followed, I would find myself creating other such bizarre constructions. Like dreams or nightmares, these crazy notions had some twisted connection to reality that I doubt I'll ever be able to unwind. Eventually, the noises in the ward calmed, as the meds kicked in, I reckon. And after another hour, an attendant arrived with a wheelchair. I was transported to the 7th floor, the psych ward. So I wasn't destined for the morgue after all. As we were leaving, 2 cops who were standing by the door talking stopped to treat me to cold stares.
I wake up to an early phone call from Sansony. It's clear that something has gone terribly wrong. She begins explaining what happened during the night. I remember my heart feeling like it stopped and interrupting her saying, "Is my dad alive?" She says that he is, and my heart restarts. I feel a huge emotional release, lots of adrenaline. I fall apart momentarily. When I regain composure, I'm able to hear the story of what went on during the night, which was told to me like this. He was sleeping in the guest room. In the middle of the night, he woke Sansony because he was convinced he could hear her whispering to other people. She told him no one was there, but he kept getting more and more agitated. He then walked into the front yard and told her to turn on all of the lights and open all of the blinds so that he could see who was in the house with her. He was saying things like "last chance" and becoming more angry. Sansony got scared, so she closed the door and locked it. Dad walked up Moreland and was found by the police. He tried to get away from them for a little while. and was finally taken in an ambulance to Grady.
Breakfast arrived. I wouldn't touch it. A nurse came to take my vitals, and I was delighted to find that she was Jamaican. I later learned that 3 or 4 others on the floor were as well. These were not the 30 Rock drag variety either. They were true, caring, but no-nonsense island women. And they weren't there to arrest me. Around mid-morning, Chris and another nurse, Tina, came in and posed probing questions about my condition. I was wary. What were they really up to? They asked if they could draw blood, and I refused, which startled them. I knew they were part of the plot, or something like that. They left, puzzled. I spent the next hours waiting for what? For the police to come and put the cuffs on me, maybe? Exhausted, I slept for a little while. Chris and Tina came back to ask more questions and jot more notes. They couldn't figure out what had gone wrong with me, but the general idea was that something physical had caused my crack up. Or I had just gone batshit crazy. Evening came, and I was standing by my bed, lost in my psychic puzzle, when I glanced out the door and saw Italia in the hallway. The same daughter who had betrayed me with her mother and Sansony and the others. Then, in the next second, it came to me that none of it was true. She wasn't guilty of anything. I rushed into the hallway and called her name as I had all those thousands of times before. She came running. I saw Sansony standing at the nurse's station and beckoned to her. I told Talia that I had lost my mind. She told me that I hadn't lost my mind at all and that they were there to take me home. When Sansony stepped up, I said, "What happened to me? Did I hurt someone?" They wrapped me in their arms as I wept, a pitiful mess. I looked over their heads, saw Adam standing alone, not knowing what to do, and I waved him close. So there we were, all wrapped in an embrace. I held my daughter tighter, kissed her, and feeling my heart turn over with misty memories, said, "My baby girl." There's being loved, and there's being loved but not feeling loved. That had always been me, slapping on the armor and fending off what I believed would weaken me. It changed when my daughter was born, and my heart opened with a sudden bang and stayed that way. Almost. I had staked out a corner in the weeks leading up to this and decided that the demons were going to have to, by God, come in and get me. Now some of that paranoia ebbed away. My family was there for me. After we had settled down, we moved into my room and they gathered around my bed. A doctor appeared at the door and asked Sansony and Talia and Adam to step back into the hall. He spoke to them in a low voice, and I heard my daughter and my wife sobbing again. I guessed that he had told them that my mind was gone and wasn't coming back, and so it would be. My nurse came in to tell them that it was time to go. When I got up to hug Italia goodbye, I looked over her shoulder at Adam and mouthed the words, "Take care of her." And then they were gone. Part 9. The Lab Rat. Over the next 3 days, I would be put through a regimen of procedures and tests. It began on that first night with the most daunting of all. A nurse and a technician arrived with a wheelchair and took me to the elevator and then down to the basement of the building and into a large, cold, empty room with nothing but one gurney pushed against a wall and a desk by the door on the far side. The nurse asked me a series of questions that I didn't understand and then stepped away. With the dead silence and the green cast of the lights, it was like the set from a sci-fi movie. The technician pushed me through the doors and down a long corridor, also empty and soundless and very spooky. I was wheeled into a stark room and directed to lie down on the gurney that was parked in the center. They laid a sheet over me, and I turned my head to see a console with an array of blinking lights and cables hanging from one side. Then it dawned on me what was happening, and my heart broke full on this time. We were now going to move to the final act, the one where they would take my mind, as in lobotomize me. I knew it was true when they began attaching little probes to my temples. I began saying sad goodbyes to the person I had known as me, to the child I had been, the man I had grown to be, for good or not, the father, the husband, the writer, because every last thread of all of them was about to be erased. As the machine blinked and hummed, I could define the curving line traveling across my skull as what was left of my brain was slowly removed, or so I thought. This is what the doctor had been explaining to Sansony and Talia and Adam in the hallway. The end of me. And yet, when it was over and they put me back in the chair and wheeled me to the 7th floor, I was aware. I could think after a fashion. In a fog, but seeing and hearing and discerning. So they had left that much. The procedure had been draining, and I slept. And then I woke to the April morning as cheerful as an elf. More technicians and doctors and nurses showed up for more tests. Wait, what about the lobotomy? How was it I could think and speak and function? Did someone forget to read the manual? That afternoon, Sansony and Italia came for visiting hours. While they were with me, a social worker arrived to ask questions about my lifestyle, she said. I decided to let my daughter speak for me. Does he drink alcohol? Talia said, yes, he does. How many drinks a day? She said, 1, sometimes 2. What about drug use? Talia said, yes, marijuana. Busted. I was using at that time, and she had seen my little pipe on the shelf. What is his sexual preference? Straight. Is he sexually active? Talia turned to Sansony. You better handle this one. I laughed for the first time. My wife answered, he is. After a few more questions, the social worker finished and went away. Talia and Sansony left soon after. And for the moment, I was at peace. So I was delighted with my Jamaican nurses. My wife had brought me one of my Army t-shirts, and the patient one room over noticed it, and we talked about the military. I got to walk in the halls with my angel nurse, and we stood by a window and gazed down at the city. It was calm, until I went back to being crazy happy. And that was interrupted only by procedures that caused me pain. The various specialists had come in and out, still trying to figure out what had sent me over the edge. And that included checking my spinal fluid for an infection. Yes, the dreaded spinal tap. You've seen them on the doctor shows, but you really don't get the full effect until a point the size of a knitting needle is pushed between your vertebrae. All the worse when it doesn't work. They poked and poked and poked some more and couldn't find a place to draw fluid. And so it went on and on and on. I was told not to flinch no matter how excruciating the pain as the effect of the lidocaine faded. And when it was over, they told me they'd been unable to tap the well. But they weren't about to give up. I was taken down to the bowels of the building for a second spinal tap. This one was some kind of sonar imaging and a different sort of needle that might be able to reach my hidden reservoirs of fluid. I wasn't looking forward to it, but it turned out that the doctor was an artist and hit pay dirt on the first plunge. I was pleased. He was pleased, and being cool about it until the nurse patched the needle puncture and I suggested that he get some Band-Aids with "This one goes to 11" printed on them. He liked that a lot. The nurse laughed out loud. We were a giddy crew, all right. It was back upstairs with more goofy exuberance over the little snacks that Sandy had brought me. It was the end of the day Wednesday, and the doctor said that I could look forward to a Friday release. Thursday brought another round of checkups. A nurse arrived to report that there was nothing in my spinal fluid that would have caused a, quote, psychotic event, unquote. I would get used to hearing that phrase, but now having it hung on me was troubling. I was officially psychotic. Crazy. My mind had blown up like an overloaded fuse box. The word was that I would indeed be released the following day, Friday, but there was one more procedure. If you've never had the pleasure of an EKG, it goes like this. You're plastered with 24 little wires all over your head and body. The test will fail if you don't sit without moving for 25 minutes, meaning not a twitch. For someone who had stayed in motion most of his waking hours during most of his waking life, this was another torture. The seconds crawled. But eventually the session ended, and the technician left, reporting that the initial findings showed nothing unusual. So, they could release me back into the world. I spent Friday morning pacing like a dog ready for a walk. After breakfast, I went next door to say goodbye to my vet buddy. We agreed that crazy could have its good moments. When mid-afternoon rolled around, Sansony and Talia showed up to process me out. It was a beautiful spring day, and I had been liberated. We live less than a mile from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and a Latino grocery, carneria, and street food takeout sits right across the street from the prison, offering what the locals call prison tacos, cheap and delicious. I insisted on a big order to celebrate my release, and Talia and Adam went to pick up the order. After dinner, they went home, and things were peaceful. We were all relieved that the ordeal was over. But it wasn't. It was, in fact, just beginning.